So we're going to fight today the whole phenomenon of fake news. And maybe you're here because you think it's a threat to our democracy, or maybe you just wonder, what is this fake news? Because everybody's throwing around the term on all sides. So you say, well, what is it then? And is it something that I really need to better understand for my students? And I would imagine that today's program, when I looked at, first of all, this is a wonderful set of workshops that you have, and it sounds like social studies in Connecticut is really alive and well, so congratulations. But we're going to try to make sense out of this if we can. And I think as I started to parse this for preparation for this, I said, yes, there is a way to look at this. But there are many contradictions in all of this. Let's think about fake news. It's either a new problem or an age-old one. We've got to consider which it is. Or it started with the dawn of television, the image, and images are so powerful as we know, or the birth of CNN trying to fill up 24/7 news. And maybe we were just looking for things to really occupy the time of the public, and maybe it wasn't all news. It's either caused by or can be contained by technology. So who's going to go on the offensive or the defensive quicker to help us with this? It can either be checked by new regulation or the reimposition of old regulations, or perhaps more government will lead to solutions that are worse than the problem. It's a threat to our democracy, or it's a natural outgrowth of a marketplace of ideas, unfettered and splintered. It's simply a manifestation of a divided country looking to reinforce their own biases and will self-correct when our politics adhere more in the center, which has been the traditional default position for American politics. That's why we are allowed two parties that have a large umbrella. But now we're so splintered, can that even work for any sustained period of time? And to some, any solution requires removing the financial incentives in propagating this material. Because when you look at it, if you looked at your morning newspaper today, I would imagine that you saw some stories that, as the first draft of history, ultimately will be revealed to be incorrect, not totally accurate. But that's different than fake news. Fake news really has intent behind it, and somebody's trying to manipulate someone in that process. Now, given that we are meeting under the auspices of both Connecticut Humanities and the Social Studies organization here in the Northeast, I think we need quickly to bring just a little bit of historical perspective to the issue. Some might look back to the 13th century BC. Ramses the Great lied about battles won and heroics performed in vanquishing the Egyptians, when it was really a stalemate at best. Or 1st century BC, Octavian ran a misinformation campaign against his rival Mark Antony, portraying him as a drunkard, a womanizer, and a puppet of Queen Cleopatra VII. Now, to the American experience, Benjamin Franklin wrote false accounts of murderous scalping Indians working with King George III in an effort to sway public opinion in favor of the American Revolution. And by the way, I think some of this will get at the question of propaganda versus fake news, because in my mind, there is a difference. Passionate defenders of slaveholding in the U.S. wrote fake news accounts that African Americans were a certain breed, and that was part of what they were attempting to do to denigrate African Americans. And then who can ever forget Remember the Maine, often paired with Go to Hell, Spain? Was that ship really blown up in Havana Harbor? It's hard to imagine that these events occurred as they were often recounted when you remember that William Randolph Hearst, who headed yellow journalism, was quoted as saying, "You bring me the army, I'll get you the war." And in, of course, the 21st century, the growth of fake news has taken on new dimensions. For our purposes, I'm referring to made-up stories designed to deceive audiences into clicking on links, enhancing traffic to websites, and becoming a profitable venture with virtually no limits other than the imagination of the purveyor. Justin Koehler, who ran a fake media operation called Disinfomedia, told NPR he started it to prove to himself and to others how quickly it could spread. He was making $10,000 to $30,000 a month on ads. And as a recent study by MIT suggests, this stuff works and spreads like weeds in a garden. Why? Well, we have to surmise that it's the shrillness and the meant-to-click headlines or the incredible photographs that outpace the spread on social media of the truth, eclipsing staid, conventional reporting. A simple lesson being relearned in the tradition of tabloids versus broadsheets. What was more entertaining, of course. And then the dissemination of fake news during the 2016 election has become a major story in America after the election. So as a preamble, let's delve into the phenomenon of fake news with our panel, made up of an award-winning journalist as well as educators. Let me introduce you to my far right, nothing political in that, Stephen G. Smith. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning multimedia photojournalist and an associate professor of visual journalism at the University of Connecticut. For more than 25 years, his images have graced the pages and the airwaves of the most prominent media organizations, including the New York Times, Time, USA Today, CNN, PBS, Time Inc., and Smithsonian Magazine, the Associated Press. And we could go on, but we've only got an hour, but an incredible record of achievement. Katie Eber is with us, and she is an educator, and she is nearest to me here. And she works for the organization that I work for so many years, and that is now Connecticut Public. And she is an education specialist for outreach at Connecticut Public Learning. For the last 5 years, starting as an intern, she has planned and coordinated educational programs and events for Connecticut Public, bringing local, state, and national public media activities to communities across Connecticut. And a woman who's really instrumental in pulling all of this together today, Lisa Marcinkowski June. She's an educator, and she has over 25 years of experience creating and implementing programs for museums and universities, including Mystic Seaport and Yukon Extension. She is currently a PhD candidate in adult learning at the NEAG College of Education at Yukon and is writing her dissertation on learning in history museums. Well, let me just pose a question, and then we will open it up to you and your questions on this topic. And let me go to Stephen. Stephen, you're in the business. How challenging is it today, and how much is the image as much a culprit in all of this as the word? And is it even more powerful given how much young people today rely on images?
You know, the word itself has been obviously disturbing. If you're a professional that loves this field as much as I do, and storytelling, and I feel it's a very honorable thing to do, is to tell people stories. And for any of them to be labeled fake, at least that I'm involved with, it's, you know, emotional and hurtful. So it's been somewhat of a difficult time. As a professor, I continue to work in the field. I work quite a bit for the Boston Globe. So yeah, I think it's challenging times and maybe emotional times for us. So I'd say it's somewhat painful. Yeah.
What do you think you can do in terms of media literacy? Katie, let me turn to you in this because you are working with young people and in a working learning lab. What can you do in terms of media literacy to help young people ferret out truthful versus perhaps less than truthful news?
Yeah, so as the folks in this room know, getting students to really understand where their news is coming from is a really working battle, right? So instead of having a student just spout out evidence that they may not normally give evidence for, we have to ask those questions. And it's important to have the students ask those questions as well, right? So we have a project called Think Along where we're focusing on bringing those questions to the classroom from something called the Center for Media Literacy, which they are all research-based research-based questions, and really having students ask, where is this coming from? Who is the author? What is their intent? What would other people think about this article or this information? And having students ask those questions is so important, right? But being the person who's asking students those questions as well and bringing that into the classroom, I think that everyone in this room is on the forefront of that, right? You guys are our first line. And so that's one thing that I think that has been really effective in classrooms that I've been in and have seen. And hopefully students will bring that back to their everyday life, right? Their everyday life in their phone, their everyday life on their tablet, and also bring it back home to their parents or to whoever's at home, right? So making sure that students understand that those are important questions to ask as citizens and as future voters and as future maybe educators, maybe any other industry, future journalists. You guys are on the front line, so I hope you are all ready for that.
But Katie, let me ask you, you brought up the phone. Given the fact that most of the young people today are getting information from the phone, for many of us growing up in a certain era, we had branded content. We were getting it from television, from radio, we were getting it from established networks. Do you find that young people discern or care when they see it on their phone if it just is entertaining or interesting or compelling, or do they go for it as opposed to wondering, where does that originate?
And that's a really good question, because I think that's where we need to be, right? We need to ask them, okay, you saw this on your phone, you saw this on Facebook, right? And we've all seen those posts that are for, one still image, but for some reason is a video. So we need to get them to understand, why is that happening? And part of the reason is because Facebook will track how long you engage with that video, but they don't do that with a still image. So whoever is putting that picture out is actually looking to see how long you're actually taking a look at that and staring at this, this picture that's really a video, right? And so to help students understand the reasons why and the intent, which is what you were saying about fake news, right? It's created with intent to deceive or intent to mislead, right? Those are the questions that we need students to ask. And I think it's coming out a little, especially with the issues with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and privacy, but it needs to be across all platforms and all apps, right? And there's so much more out there now than there ever was. There's more information, there's more places to go. And I think that's something that we need to take a look at as we're, giving our students information. We should be the first line of that, but then also students need to do that on their own as well. And they are starting to, right? Some of them aren't on Facebook, they're just mostly on one or two pieces of social media instead of all 20. So that's one way I think they're doing it themselves.
And Stephen, the image, I was just talking to somebody whose son works in analytics now on photography, and just realizing how much they're able to discern by analyzing the impact of how long somebody stays on a photo, whether that photo generates sales or activity. And we're talking here a lot about click-through, because that's a big part of this. How important is our understanding of the manipulation of the visual image today?
Well, you came back to that, national branding. I think that one of the things that national or local media does is it has a system set up to identify fake images, fake video, things that have been manipulated. And of course, in social media, we don't have those systems. So we have working professionals that's part of their job as an editor, is to monitor how accurate is this caption, how accurate is this picture, and if it's not, it's generally out of there. And I'm not saying that there's not mistakes made, but the full intent is to provide, solid evidence-based information. And so I think it's very critical, and I think it brings up something that digital media sometimes lacks a filter, and that filter, of course, can be the editors that oversee those images, those stories, and I think that's a pretty critical part of this.
Lisa, let's get you into this. I mean, when we look at it, what goes on social media is that everybody's their own editor, their own journalist, their own reporter. Even in my podcast, I have no limitations except my own history and, hopefully integrity. I could put out anything I want. So this is more like Times Square than the New York Times. So what do you do to guard against some of the evildoers in this space?
Well, I have sort of two answers to that question. One is that there are a lot of resources out there that you can turn to help your students understand what they're looking at and what they're reading and how to vet it themselves. And we'll cover a lot of those in the workshop. But there's tons. There's almost an overwhelming amount of information about how to combat fake news, as there is fake news in some ways, because everybody realizes it's such a serious problem. The flip side of this issue, and we talked about this in some of our planning meetings, is that these kids grew up on social media. They grew up on their phones. They grew up with this no-holds-barred kind of information coming at them. And one of the things we talked about is that we're not really sure that students today understand what good journalism is. Like, what is journalism itself? And what are these safeguards that Steve was talking about? What are these standards that journalists hold themselves to not knowingly propagate incorrect information? So I think there's probably a lack of understanding as to what journalism is supposed to do. So it's kind of hard to separate out what might be good journalism, what might be just fake news, because they don't really know how to compare them to each other.
Let's go back to the question of propaganda versus fake news, because the way I would define it is propaganda is something that a state organ or an official source is using to move the public in a certain direction or maintain their power or authority, as opposed to fake news, which may be an adjunct to that, but isn't really the government putting that forward. Yet in America today, we have our government leader calling others fake news, which have been historically very reliable purveyors. So how are we to even understand who is combating this issue of fake news when everyone's pointing fingers at each other? Katie, why don't you help us with that?
Oh boy. So I was actually thinking about this morning on my drive here, and I was thinking of it in terms of music and the idea that the propaganda is the trumpet fanfare, right? It's that thing that's really championing this one thing. It's only the sound that drowns out everything else, but only for a certain period of time. But really, fake news is that thing that's constantly there. It's the annoying kazoo in your ear that's just this buzzing, right? And it's just there to distract you from everything else. So I think that's really how I was thinking about it. But I also think that it's the idea of the state arm providing that. And we need to really define what fake news is, especially since we have people who are just calling news they don't agree with fake news, when it's really that thing with the intent to mislead or make you think a certain way. So that's.
But isn't that the point right now, that our politics is driving this in many ways? And if we don't get closer to the center again, where we're both out on extremes, then, fake news is anything I disagree with, or I won't watch because I don't think it's credible any longer. Stephen, how do we even begin to adjust for that?
I think maybe this is the most concerning part of it, to me anyways, is, to label things that you disagree with, or maybe that are critical of things that you're working on, as fake news. It's really taking advantage of people that don't understand how journalists work or journalism works. And I think that's pretty concerning to me. And we see it not only with our current leader, but we're beginning to see it obviously around the world as well, because they're taking his cue and how that's working. And that's concerning, and I think we do need to step up to the plate and try to respond to that in some ways that are powerful. And of course, as educators, we can do that through various forms of education.
Lisa, do you think that there's anything the government should be doing to step in to this, to try to regulate? Some people say a reimposition of the fairness doctrine might be helpful. Some say we don't want the government involved. Others are saying, what about putting more strictures on content? Political speech has wide berth in America. Is that a slippery slope?
That is a very good question. Let's see. Well, I'm just going to give a little shout out to Katie and her organization, because their Think Along module on fake news is a question that is posed, and is, should creating fake news be illegal?
Well, should fake news be illegal to publish?
Should fake news be illegal to publish? So, which is a great question. It's like, oh, yeah, should it? Maybe, I don't know. So that's something we have to think about. But if you go back in history, and you were talking about the yellow journalism from the late 19th century, what was interesting about that is that that really spurred on the development of what we would consider professional journalism today. I mean, the sort of the standards and the ethics and the procedures kind of grew out of a response to the yellow journalism and the sensationalism back then. So I don't know if the government is going to be effective in this necessarily, especially the way the government is blurring all the lines right now. I don't know if we can turn to them for help. So it may, again, turn out to be more of a sort of a grassroots response to people going, oh, wait a minute, this is just too much, and we need to deal with this ourselves, and we need to put our own best practices into place. So.
Well, let me go back to a couple of seminal pieces of fiction that I know you don't necessarily teach in your classrooms, but I want to ask whether we're closer to one vision of the future than another. And again, there was a central argument in a book that was written back in 1985 about whether it was going to be 1984 that was really controlling our thought process as we move forward, or Brave New World. 1984 came and went. There was no information censoring movement or restricting individual, activity within our state. However, when you look at Brave New World, technology sedating us, we're just consuming it, we're engorged with it, it's instant gratification. I guess the argument that Neil Postman made in 1985, that Brave New World was really something we should look at. Are we closer to that reality than 1984, Stephen?
Boy, that's a tough one. I mean, I look at the digital era and the new problems that it's presented, and we could look historically back and think about, when cable news became so dominant, and then we began to see more journalism coming into silos. And now we see, the filter lifted off completely with digital media, and anybody has the opportunity to spread misinformation or to create great stories. And I think it's a double-edged sword that I think can be used in very positive ways. And I think there are many people, the vast majority of people, are using it in very positive ways. And occasionally, that double-edged sword, people are finding ways to monetize it in negative ways. And coming back to the question about whether or not we can legislate that, I think it's pretty difficult. I mean, libel exists, and certainly libel is a law that could come into play here in many situations. And I know even our current leader has expressed he wanted to see some libel reform. I think it's a pretty challenging opportunity, or a pretty challenging situation.
Well, when we look at it today, of course, to be a doctor, you need a license. To be a lawyer, you need a license. In media, you really don't need a license. And in fact, the license, which was really complicated, you did need a broadcast license. But today, anybody can be a broadcaster. I think that's YouTube's slogan. So what do we do in that regard, Lisa? How do we even begin? Because it's such a bottom-up process. Do we have to take much more personal responsibility? If I go back to a gentleman who seems back in the rearview mirror, but let me read what he said. What is required of us now is a new era of responsibility, giving our all to a difficult task. This is the price and the promise of citizenship. And that was Barack Obama just a couple of years ago. So the question is, what are we responsible for? Do we begin policing the information more carefully? Do we begin really asking more questions? And I know there used to be a program called Newspaper in Education, and that was meant to give people a critical examination of the news. But today, newspapers seem so passé to a young audience. So how do you begin to say to them, that citizen journalist that you're following every day may not have the journalistic standards in mind that perhaps you think they do? How do we do that without undermining all thought that goes on in this country?
Boy, if we had all the good answers to these questions, we'd probably be making some serious money. Well, I think it is incumbent on everybody to use their critical thinking skills when they're looking at some of this stuff coming on social media. We're certainly all becoming more aware of how our own personal biases, for instance on Facebook, might have influenced the kinds of things that came across our feed due to all this exciting Cambridge Analytica stuff going on. But I distinctly remember during the 2016 election season, all sorts of stuff was floating around on Facebook. You know, I'll admit it, I'm more on the liberal side of things, and so that was what was showing up in my feed. But I remember starting to notice patterns, like some people would post certain things from certain websites, and you go to that website and you're like, it's not horrible, but it's this very specific viewpoint that doesn't take the other side's viewpoint into consideration. And so I remember starting to notice, like, that website, I'm not going to read that article because I know what the slant is going to be necessarily. My favorite thing, though, that really tipped me off was it showed up in my feed, and it was an article about how Hillary Clinton and John Kerry won the Nobel Peace Prize for the Iran nuclear deal. And I was like, what? Wait a minute, where is this coming from? So that was the first time that I was like, okay, instead of just like noticing patterns, I really have to pay attention to what this stuff is and where it's coming from. So I think we do have a responsibility, but at the same time, it can be overwhelming. Again, it's the amount of information, and it's like now you're asking us to like vet every single piece of information we look at. I mean, that takes a lot of time and energy.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a huge responsibility, and it does come back to, where are your sources of information and making sure that you're well read and looking at a variety of different media organizations and all sorts of reading. I think that all those things are super critical in this, because I think it is, when we face something on, say, something like Facebook, and I remember starting into several articles that, friends or family had sent me, and 3 paragraphs in, I'm doubting its validity, and I'm, I think that's fake news. Please don't share it. Sometimes it's, even people politically that I may know or have photographed, and so sometimes it's really hurtful. Again, there it comes back to that emotion, because if you know somebody and you hear or see these things that are being told, it's disturbing.
What about branding? Would that help if something were branded more categorically as opinion, commentary, news analysis, or what have you? Or would it be helpful, without putting new strictures on, to have something such as what Steve Brill, who founded Court TV, is talking about, a new service called NewsGuard. And in it would use human beings, not just algorithms, to rate news brands, green, yellow, or red, depending on their critical assessment of real journalism versus the purveyance of fake news. And what they would do is, like the movies that have ratings and the like, put those on various websites. Would that be useful without being too intrusive? Katie?
Oh, geez. I think it would be useful. But there's a slippery slope there too, right? Because if you're focusing on that one group, Like if you think about fact checking, right? One group could say that this is factual, one group could say that's not. Now, who's saying that those are, right? It's now we're getting up the tree. Who's saying that those are credible? Who's saying that that's credible? Who's saying that that's credible? And then it needs to go back to somewhere, right? So that's a little bit of a slippery slope there. But we kind of see that with social media, the actual accounts doing that, right? We see verified Twitter accounts. We see verified Facebook pages. So in some way, you have to go through that second step. But again, there's no one at the top of that tree saying, yes, this is a real person versus a Russian bot, right?
I think labeling is really important, particularly on opinion pieces. I think, that it's not uncommon at all for me to run into somebody that has read an opinion piece and feels that it was biased. I'm like, oh, it's an opinion piece. And so I'm in that pretty much continuous form of explanation. And I think sometimes when pieces are linked, they don't realize that it's opinion piece because they're not seeing how it's being displayed originally, let's say on the New York Times or Washington Post or wherever it's coming from. And I think in some ways, as communicators, I think sometimes we fail in that area. We fail to communicate what an opinion piece is and why we have them and the importance of them. And then I think, with digital media and the fact that things are being shared and moved around so easily, that those labels need to stick. And I think that, very similar in the visual arena, we think about that as, is this a documentary image that represents reality, or is this some form of illustration? And those images need to be clearly labeled and have been for a number of years by major media organizations. And so I think those labels are even more critical today, to be honest with you, because the fact things are so easily shared and separated from the context that they were originally in. I think those things are important because originally they may have been in the context where there were two opinion pieces of opposing views, and now all of a sudden we're just seeing the one.
Well, do you want to see the fairness doctrine reinstated where opposing views, because don't forget, before Rush Limbaugh and the like, that was required, and talk radio was a very different beast.
Well, that's a tough one, I think. I don't know if I'm ready to jump into that.
Katie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think part of the problem too is that if we're labeling things, not everyone looks at labels. There used to be a website that was really fun to look at called Literally Unbelievable. And what it was people thinking that articles from The Onion, which is a news satire site, were real on social media. And it was really interesting to look at because you would see these people react in a second without taking a look and saying, there's no way this is real, right? Because if you get into The Onion, you're looking at 3 or 4 articles and you're like, there's no way, right? But no one's taking that time to see that and say, this label means that this is this thing. So I think that's a problem there too. We need to take more time with the sources that we see. And even if you're just scrolling past it and you see something ridiculous, at that point you have to stop and analyze it, right? It stops you. And we need more of that.
And by the time that happens, it's been retweeted across the globe. So here's a final question before we open it up to you who are here. Please get to a microphone if you'd like to ask a question, because we are recording this, and I will be making this into a podcast, so it will be available over time. But please get to a microphone. But the question is, with this whole controversy with Facebook, and there's a lot wrapped up in that, the question is, will the algorithms or will whatever the source is, you find it on Facebook or Twitter or what have you, will they be developing defensive mechanisms that are more powerful than the offensive attempt if you don't take the commercialization and the monetization out of this? Can it ever keep up? Katie, and down the line?
Well, I, for one, welcome our new robot overlords. But I think that if we're relying on those things, right, there still have to be people behind them. And people are human. And even at that point, then robots are human, right? So I think we still need to have a nation of, or in a world of critical thinkers that are there to be that stop.
Lisa?
Yeah, I think the challenge with fighting fake news is that fake news is often simple. It's very emotional. It may go straight to a bias that you already have, and so you may not be willing to check it because it's your bias and you think it's awesome. And so trying to find a way to sort of fight that is going to be challenging, because that's sort of like the easy way to go straight for the kill. And we're saying, oh, but you got to stop and look at everything. So I think maybe, hopefully, at some point, we're going to figure out a good way to combat this.
Stephen?
You already have a microphone.
Boy, it is funny to think about that reality has a hard time competing against, made up stories. And you think about, how this is driven financially by who can get the most clicks. And I can concoct a pretty wild story, and if I do concoct a wild story, I get a lot of clicks, or whoever does it gets a lot of clicks, and you can see that that's what's driving this, and it's obviously it's disturbing. How to control it? Obviously, as journalists, we need to educate, inform, and to be passionate about being accurate and ethical. I think those things are critical, and we need to double down on those things. And I play both roles as an educator. It's really important that I continue to educate and inform, and to encourage people to be critical thinkers, and to be smarter than Facebook, if you can imagine. Right, and when it's time to put it away, and when it's time to call a spade, as far as when we see fake news or fake imagery.
Just a question. How many of you watch Fox News and MSNBC in the same night?
And are willing to admit it.
Okay. All right. How many of you read the New York Times and the New York Post in the same day? Okay. Interesting. Okay, you have a question.
Sure. I wanted to just make a comment. I'm with Connecticut Public, and I think to your point about the news, I've watched over the past 2 years our newsroom transform in terms of how we approach content, and what stories should we put out there with Connecticut Public Radio, WNPR. And I think we're adding new voices to our content, which I think we have a responsibility, in other media stations and news outlets also are experiencing that. So we're approaching how we report and how we, present the news to Connecticut and to the world. Adding those voices that usually kind of weren't at the table, I think, is what we're finding within our newsroom. Also being a trusted source, Connecticut Public and PBS and NPR, I think we have a responsibility, and why we worked with Think Along to curate that information so that we have a solid example for students. We work with students on a daily basis, and I think that was one of the critical, needs that, Katie would go into a classroom, and I have the privilege of working with this brilliant young woman every day, and hired her from intern, and was smart enough to say she needs to be full-time on our team, and I'm just glad that she stayed with us. But, the team that we work with go in like you every day, and Justin has worked with us in the classroom with Hartford Public Schools, and you're wrestling with it, and it's real time, and there aren't any answers. And so Katie will go to her desk, find something out, and then go back to the work, like many of you do as teachers every day. And so what I like about Think Along is that we've taken all those years of experiences and those missed opportunities that we didn't connect and we didn't get to that student, and then we've kind of packaged it into a format that works for teachers, that isn't so overwhelming, overload. We tried to connect to standards, everything that you would need. And this isn't an infomercial for Think Along. There are a lot of web-based items that you can find out there, and I would say find those that are curating information that's trusted, that's vetted. To your point about branding, you can feel safe sharing it. You don't have to be the expert on every topic, and I like that about the modules, because they expect teachers, you are Google. The students come to you and say, well, what is this, mister? And you're like, oh, do I know that? Do I not know it? So it's a way for teachers to grow and expand along with the students. So we have a booth here. I would encourage you to look at it, but I wanted to just point out that curated, safe, trusted source information. And what it does is it provides students a safe environment to have civil discourse and to have a pro or a con. And even they don't know which side they're going to debate, so they have to do both. And that's the beauty of it. So I think we just need more of kind of the old school teaching, kind of linked with kind of the newness of digital media and the sexiness of media literacy and all these new words. But there's still something, like you said, with the human touch, the critical thinking, and linking that all together. So, thank you.
Well, let me put that into a question. I mean, do you think that traditional media has either given up and said that this wellspring of citizen journalists and bottom-up journalism is just so pervasive we don't even know where to begin to attack this hydro-headed monster, or that they haven't really played enough in that space effectively, or have they perhaps at times succumbed and said, well, if they want sizzle and they don't want the steak, here's the sizzle. So do you think that traditional media has played a role in all of this? Let's just go down the line, Stephen.
All of the above. I apologize, that seems like a cop-out, but I'd say yes, that, potentially yes to all of those. And because every media organization has probably potentially handled it differently. I love what you said about, adding diversity to our situations. And I think that's a really critical part of this, because we will have greater trust when the people that are gathering the news are more diverse group. And I think that that's really, really important, and we can't overlook that. And it's been that has been an issue. And you think about it, at times the New York Times is called out because they're doing what they're referred to as parachute journalists, sending journalists into maybe rural areas, and they may not understand the issues in those situations, and there becomes a bit of tension at times. And so there's another opportunity to have maybe a slightly more diverse staff or group that are gathering the news, and I think that's an important element of this. And continuing to develop our ethics as things evolve and change, I think that's a critical part of this.
And I'd love to have the others react to that about whether the traditional media is giving up, succumbing, whatever. But I'd also love to hear from any teachers who have considered their attempts to talk to their students about this issue effective, perhaps more so than they might have imagined. Was there any tack you might take with your students as you discuss this? And it's a very complicated issue as we're all defining it today. So I'd love to know if anybody's had great success, or at least some success, in helping their students through this labyrinth. But Lisa, what do you say about the traditional media and how they have been or should be responding?
I'm old enough that I still rely on the traditional media for, more or less reasonably honest information. So I feel like the major newspapers are doing a good job of trying to keep up these standards and try to fight against this. Organizations like the New York Times and the Washington Post and a lot of other, big city newspapers. The problem I think we have now is that we're losing so many local newspapers because they've all kind of gotten sucked up into other media empires, or local newspapers don't even seem to have the local touch anymore, like Steve was talking about.
The middle market has really suffered.
Yeah.
And I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
no, that's okay.
Yeah, it really has suffered.
Yeah, so I think you have a lack of really effective journalism at that level. And people still, maybe not the young people, but there's still a lot of people who rely on the local news for their information and want to know what's going on in their communities. I'm fortunate enough, I live down on the shoreline, so we get the Day newspaper, which is still one of those, holdout great local newspapers. But I really see that as being a problem, is feeding into this whole not trusting journalism problem, because if they don't even know who's running their local paper anymore, then how can they trust that information?
And I think, too, just a show of hands, how many folks in this room create content with their students around community or asking them questions to report on things? See a few hands. See, that's great, because those local channels that are going away now, there's students who can fill in that gap, right? They're in their communities, and if, as the gatekeepers of that, as teachers, you can teach them the right way to do that, right? You're there to help them tell their stories. And it was the kind of thing we were talking about earlier with the citizen journalism. These are your citizen journalists, right? These are your students who are in their communities every day and seeing things and want to tell their stories, and we can give them a voice, right?
Okay. Thank you for coming up.
Hi, I'm John Bassett from Newton North High School and Fork year I'm teaching. We've had some success at Newton North with teaching kids to try to analyze what they're actually looking at on the screen. It's interesting, it's actually time consuming, and it means you've got to not teach something else, so you can teach kids how to do a reverse image search and find out where this thing actually came from. And I think that our robot overlords are going to get cleverer and stay ahead of us on that. But on a related question, I enjoyed that analogy to yellow journalism, in that the modern media standards that we have become accustomed to came out of a realization that, wow, yellow journalism is kind of bad. Is there perhaps reason for optimism that we're having panels like this and Zuckerberg is talking to Congress, and that there's sort of a growing understanding? Yellow journalism was new. It was mass journalism. It was a new thing, and then we sort of figured out how to tame it. Could we possibly do the same thing?
I'm certainly optimistic. I mean, I think that this is something that's going to correct itself. I think there's a lot of great journalism being done, and I think there's a lot of great education being done by folks like yourself. And I see it self-correcting. And even just in this last week, I think we've made some serious progress.
Hi, my name is Jen Blank. I'm a middle school teacher from Danbury. My question actually is, are we asking the wrong questions? Like, we're looking at the industry of media and journalism. Should we be looking economic? Should we be looking at antitrust laws, either enacting additional ones or enforcing the ones we have or modifying the existing ones? Because I feel like there's been an oligarchical movement of consolidation, to your point, Lisa, that we used to have a wealth of options in terms to choose from, but I've been in Miami the last 9 years. Miami Herald is not an independent newspaper.
Right.
It's all canned. So when you're allowing these companies to continue to merge and they're all becoming part of one whole, and you're looking at the entire telecommunications company industry being maybe comprised of 5-6 companies, how are you really getting diversity in news? You can have a bunch of different people. You can have people from all walks of life on staff. But ultimately, it's still being controlled by a central brain. And until you break up that brain, and I would argue apply James Madison's extended sphere argument from Federalist 10, break up the faction. Like, you want more factions. Now we just seem to be concentrating, and I feel like a lot of this is driving.
But I'd like to ask you a question. I understand what you're saying, and this FCC certainly is not about that. They are about allowing even more conglomeration of different cross-media. But we're also talking about people out there who don't need a printing press any longer, who are using this new technology randomly thus far, but they're going to get a lot more sophisticated as we go along, and they don't need a banner that says Miami Herald, whether that has been impugned in terms of this or not. We're also talking about all these other forces below. You were suggesting we need more. Well, we've got a cacophony out there right now.
Well, I don't think those individual forces are driving the discussion. I think it's the bigger conglomerates that are, which is my major concern, that these little guys are feeding into this larger fight that we're having, and we're all getting massively distracted while power is continuing to be concentrated. And I'm wondering
So you're a fan of Rod Serling and The Twilight Zone, I can tell. I remember that episode. Yes, thank you.
I'm wondering what we do as educators in talking to students who don't consume information, that don't follow the news, don't read the paper, don't watch the evening news, don't click on websites that are news, and maybe you're just hearing about stuff from their friends or their family. How do we start to talk to them about the importance of following what's going on in the world today?
Scott, you just made me remember my museum education days where I was supervising tour guides, and they would come up with some interesting stories sometimes that they weren't trained on. And, our standard question when we heard these new pieces of information was, can you document that? Like, where did you get that information? And if it turned out that they were just chatting about it in the guides room, and they all liked the story and they all started telling it, well, then it's like, okay, well, you can't use that anymore because it's not actually based in the information that we're trying to share at our institution. And so that could be like a kind of a simple question you ask, oh, where'd you hear that? Can you document that? Where did it come from? That could be a start.
Just yesterday, we had a field trip to the station with a group of students from Wilcox Tech in Meriden. And the question we were asking was, does social media marketing exploit teenagers? And we had a really interesting student who was not on any social media. And they were asking, well, like, what can I bring to this table, right? What can I bring to this conversation? I'm like, well, you have an entirely different perspective, right? You're not there. Tell us why. Tell us what you're hearing about those things. Tell us why your decision was to not be on them, or was it your decision, right? So you can bring those students who aren't engaging with the news in to ask them why, and ask them the same critical questions that you're asking of your other students, but make sure that they're included in the conversation.
I came in not too long ago, and a simple answer, I was listening to this gentleman that just came in, is how much do you educate parents? I've been in the early childhood where I was a director and also teach, and a big factor of finding out with your media news, bringing in how much do you talk to them. That's how we can find out what really is going on, because we can educate all we can with kids. I've dealt with different diversities coming in, also families that are divorced, and we have a big thing with single moms. So how much a part of that has come into your lives?
I guess from my perspective, as a journalist working in the field, I think that every assignment is an opportunity to educate the people that I might be doing a story on about the ethics of journalism and why I feel it's an honor to tell their story. So I hope that every time I leave a story, they have a much better understanding of what journalism is, parents, children, whoever I'm working with. And that's been a long-term goal of mine, long before these issues became a hot button.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to add a little story to that. When I was growing up, my mother was one of those people that would talk back to the TV. She would watch the news, and she would make comments, and she would agree or she would disagree, but she was always talking back to the TV, and even, fictional shows, like Love Boat and stuff. I don't know. So anyway, I remember when I was a kid, it was like so annoying, right? But now that I'm an adult, I do the same thing. I'm always talking back to the TV. My husband just sits there, and he's like, but I'm like, well, that's not exactly right. I heard on NPR that there's a whole bigger story to this, when we're watching NBC News at night. So that could be like a really simple thing for parents to do. Just start questioning what you're watching. And then maybe together you can, if you have access to a computer, go online and start looking at more information about it and see if you can come up with a better picture of it.
By the way, we have very little time, but we do have somebody who wants to ask a question, so if you can be quick about it.
Hi, my name's Leanne Cassidy. I teach social studies in Region 15 in Middlebury, Connecticut. It's actually to address your question, what are educators doing to help with this? One of the things, we look at journalism and how they assess resources when they're trying to write their piece. What do they look at for the credibility? So we are starting to develop resources for children to use to assess the credibility of the sites that they're using online so that they can judge whether the person has an expertise in the area. And I think that's going to be really critical as we move forward for our children, to give them those resources, teach them how to actually assess what it is they're looking at online. And so by developing those resources for kids, we can draw them in not only to the news, to the current events that are going on, but also give them the ability to tell real from fake, authentic to something that's just being done as an opinion piece. And we have to teach them those skills.
Well, remember, as kids, they always said, consider the source.
Right.
And we have to get back to that. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank Lisa and Katie and Stephen and all of you for sitting. I hope there was something that came out of this that got you thinking. Let me leave you with this closing. Neil Postman, again, a great book from 1985, and he reminds us Orwell's vision was much easier to recognize and to oppose than Huxley's. Everything in our background has prepared us to know and resist a prison when the gates begin to close around us. But who is prepared to take arms against all forms of amusement? All right. I hope that left you with something to think about. Thank you very much for coming today.